learning Buddhism versus doing Buddhism. There are some crucial differences that I think we have to really understand and get our minds around. And I'll discuss some of those coming right up. Welcome, Earthlings. I'm Doug Smith. I'm Study Director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing. So there's some crucial differences, I think, between learning about Buddhism or learning Buddhism and doing or practicing Buddhism. And this is a difference I've thought about for a while from different angles. It's one that I wasn't really aware of until I started practicing Buddhism in earnest. Before that, I wouldn't really have seen much of a difference, but now I do. And it's a difference that I think is interesting and I think worth knowing about and worth keeping in mind, no matter how our approach to Buddhism is at the present time. When we're learning about Buddhism, that is in school, which is the most obvious example if we're taking courses on Buddhism, let's say at university, or whether we're learning about it by reading books or looking at websites, whatever it happens to be, those are all kind of similar in certain ways. Basically, when we're in that kind of frame of mind, what we're trying to do is to see how Buddhism is different from other belief systems. We're trying to get at the sort of weird and different, the different parts, the surprising and unusual bits of Buddhism, the difficult bits. And we're going to be thinking about things like the concept of non-self. We're going to be thinking about what is emptiness, or shunyata as they call it in Sanskrit. We're going to be thinking about dependent origination, these very strange, deep ideas within Buddhism. That, of course, is wonderful. It's important to the path to get to know these things and to know them deeply. But to be perfectly honest, for most of us, for most of you, even for me, most of the time, these are not necessary. That's stuff that comes later on, and that's stuff that comes when we're, getting really into the material, but most of what we do has nothing to do with that kind of complex stuff. But when we're learning about Buddhism, the complex stuff is what's on the forefront. It's what we learn about all the time, or at least it's what we spend most of our time focused on because we're trying to learn it and understand it. The other part of learning about Buddhism is that it's oftentimes involved in debate and argument. For example, in schools, oftentimes our teachers, our professors, will have us either argue a particular position in a paper that we have to write for them, or debate some proposition in the classroom where you'll have to take one side and somebody will take another. That kind of debate or argument mind is one that also appears often on the web, in comment sections, in bulletin boards, in forums, where people have opinions and basically spend their time trying to debate with other people or try to find what's wrong in somebody else's opinion or where they can be corrected. Just as I said with learning, there is a great deal of benefit that can be achieved by doing these things. I don't think we should overlook that. It often is indeed important for somebody to correct us if our view is incorrect. And often in schools or on forums and the internet, we'll find people who know the material more deeply than we do, or know the particular subject that we're discussing much better than we do. And so having them on there can indeed be a source of learning for us and can be a source of eventual advancement for us as we understand these kinds of concepts better. So when we approach Buddhism from a perspective of learning about it, then what we get into is issues of knowledge and claims. Knowledge being the sorts of things that can be graded. Do you know what the Four Noble Truths are? Do you know what the Eightfold Path is? What all of the parts of the Eightfold Path are, for example? The kinds of things, again, that that a teacher could potentially put a grade on, could tell you this is correct and that's not correct. That's important. Issues about claims, issues about views, viewpoints, things that we can debate. Again, important. But that's only how we approach Buddhism when we come from the perspective of learning about it, of separating it from other belief systems, of separating it from other philosophies or other religions. However, we can also come at Buddhism from a different perspective. And I think for many of us coming from the first perspective, we're not even aware that there's a different perspective. We think that's how you approach Buddhism. And I think when I discuss, or at least I think when I'm in discussions with people who are more scholarly or more scholars about Buddhism, they will sort of think that the only way to approach Buddhism is from this kind of perspective. There is another, which is to approach it from the perspective of doing Buddhism or practicing Buddhism. And from this secondary perspective, what we really want to know is what's important, what's wise, how can we use Buddhism or the ideas of Buddhism to improve our lives. And at that point, we get a very different group of concerns. What is important to know? Well, the first thing that's important to know is ethics, is how to behave in a way that's skillful in the world, is to be kind to people, is to try not to harm people as much as we can, to try to be nice, to try to be useful in our lives to other people. And that is something that the Buddha, when he was in the position of teacher, when he was being asked, what is Buddhism? I mean, what are you teaching? What is the Dharma for you, Gautama? His answer to everybody would have started with just this, with generosity and with ethics. With generosity being to be generous to one another, to be generous to people in need, to be generous to the Sangha, not to hold too tightly to our possessions, and to be kind to one another, to be compassionate, not to harm. These are sort of his first and most basic instructions. There's a sense to them in which they're kind of obvious, in the sense that, many people, professors, let's say, of Buddhist studies, will almost overlook them because there's a kind of obviousness to them that makes them less interesting, say, compared to something like dependent origination, which is complex and difficult. This stuff seems relatively simple and straightforward. But for all that, it's arguably more important. I mean, it's really something that we really have to keep in mind every minute of the day. Whereas dependent origination is something that's really quite abstruse and, of course, very important on its own, but something we'll get to eventually down the line. So ethics is important to know about. What else? Well, another thing it's important to know about is that all things change. And because all things change and pass away, greed and ownership are ultimately fruitless. Greed will never get us permanent satisfaction, because anything that we're greedy for will change. Either our greed will change, our desire for it will change, our decision that what we want is good will change, our tastes change over time, and then the objects themselves, of course, change and decay and fall apart. Greed and ownership are not the sorts of things that we should look to for ultimate satisfaction. Anytime that we are greedy for something or want something, we should always hold that with a mind understanding wisely that that thing, whatever it is never going to provide us ultimate satisfaction. So it's not the end of the world if we don't get it. So what else is wise and important to know? Well, another thing that's wise and important to know is how to relax ourselves, is how to reduce the emotional pull that is on our minds so that we can calm ourselves down and come to see the functioning of our minds in a more direct and accurate way. Because insofar as we are under the sway of emotions pulling us one way or another, our view into our own mind is going to be clouded. In the first place, we're not going to have the steadiness of mind to actually inquire into our own reactions to things. But secondly, if our mind is flitting here and there based on emotional pulls, we're not going to really be able to see the way it works very accurately. In order to do that, we really do need to calm the mind down and so reduce the impact of particular emotions on us, so that we can see how those emotions are either useful or not useful, how they're skillful or unskillful. And we'll find, I think, by doing that many of these emotions are really unskillful, and that we should therefore be working as much as we can to try to denourish them, and to try to not do things that make them recur or that make them worse. And so, in order to, when we realize this, then we'll realize that meditation, that doing certain kinds of say, breathing meditation or other kinds of meditation that calm us down are really wise ways of living, or wise things that we can include in our lives every day. So these three things that I've suggested are wise and important aren't complicated. They're simple in a certain sense of understanding them. They don't take a lot of brain power to understand. So they're simple, they're direct. What they are, however, is difficult in practice. So we understand that we should be ethical. We understand that things change, and so therefore nothing that we actually ever own for some temporary period of time is going to be a permanent solution to anything. And we understand that stress is bad, and that getting emotionally pulled one way or another is bad, that we should therefore find ways to calm down. We understand all three of these things. So therefore, they're not the kinds of things that interest our mind in a kind of way of getting us, intellectually kind of riled up. And that's what distinguishes them from learning about Buddhism. When we learn about Buddhism in the first sense, then we're dealing with the complicated stuff. But when we're actually practicing Buddhism, I think 90 to 95% of the time, what we're dealing with is the simple stuff that's difficult in practice. So, I myself love getting into geeky discussions about dependent origination or emptiness or non-self. They're fascinating. But we have to put them in perspective. And I think if we're only dealing with the former one, and in particular if we're finding ourselves violating the second three when we deal with the first, then we're in a problem. If we find ourselves getting involved with, let's say, internet discussions or debates with colleagues, friends, other people in Buddhism or whatever, or in the real world who aren't Buddhists, about any of these, about non-self, about dependent origination, and so that we're unkind to them, so that we're getting emotionally riled up, so that we're thinking that if we just win this one debate, the world will be perfect for the rest of our lives, kind of thing, which is, when we think about it, we realize is not true, but sometimes we get our minds emotionally into that kind of place. When we're violating the second three, the Buddhism in practice part, then there's a problem. And so I think we really do have to keep these in balance and understand that it's really the practice that's important. The first is great, but should really be our 5 or 10% and not our 80 to 90%. So if this kind of discussion is helpful for you, consider subscribing, give it a thumbs up, and if you want to help out the channel, check out my Patreon page. It's linked here down below. Thanks so much to all my patrons on Patreon. It really does make the whole thing worthwhile and can help support the work that I'm doing and that we're all doing together here. So thanks so much, and I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, be well.